Washington Journal continues.
And joining us now is Clyde Cruz. He's the Vice President of Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he is here to discuss their annual survey of the size, scope, and cost of federal regulations. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So first, tell our viewers exactly what is the Competitive Enterprise Institute and what's the mission of the organization?
Okay, CEI is 33 years old. It's a free market-oriented, small L libertarian, you might say, policy and advocacy group, and we work on a number of regulatory issues. We tend not to do tax and budget type issues, but tend to focus on the regulatory enterprise because, as you know, the federal government doesn't just spend money, it also influences the economy through regulations and so forth. So that's kind of our area of focus.
Okay, and the website is cei.org.
cei.org.
And how are you funded?
Like every policy group there is, we're funded by individuals, foundations, and corporations. And that, in fact, in a sense, if free market ideas are to be supported, corporations and foundations and individuals should support free enterprise, and that's how in this world, that's how we support our ideas. Oh. I got started in this issue. I was interested in public policy ideas and free markets and limited government back when I was in college, and got involved in these things a long time ago. And I think a lot of people are that way, whether it's left and right, you get interested in a certain area of focus, and that's where you go. And you tend to work with groups that share your ideas.
Okay, and you put out this report, it's called 10,000 Commandments.
10,000 Commandments.
About federal rules and regulations. And in the report it says regulations don't get much attention in policy debates because unlike taxes, they're unbudgeted and therefore difficult to quantify. So sort of relate to our viewers, how do these regulations really affect everyday folks, and do they?
They do, and this is interesting because we have an opportunity now for some bipartisan reform on regulation. There's a bipartisan bill that has the most legs, it has bipartisan pedigree on some of the reforms it does, but regulations affect us in all ways, and one of the top issues now is environmental regulations, of course, but Dodd-Frank rules. I think you've got a segment coming up talking about the healthcare legislation and so forth. So in all these walks of life, regulation affects us. It's paperwork, it's environmental, it's health and safety, it's economic interventions, it's all of these sorts of things. And while it's unlike taxes, where you can look up and see what the federal government spends, it's about $3.8 trillion right now. Regulations are different. They're not calculated the same way by the government, so it's a much tougher thing to do, and there's a lot more debate about it as well. That's a contentious issue, but it's a lot of, it's very interesting to work on, and I've got some optimism about some reforms too.
Okay, we'll get to those. We have Clyde Cruz with us now. He is the Vice President of Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and we're talking about regulations and how they're quantified and the CEI's new report on them. Republicans can call 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Now, just a little bit more about doing this report. How long has CEI been doing this report, and exactly what are you trying to let folks know about regulations?
Yes, unfortunately, it's been over 20 years now, so I tell everybody, y'all are getting old. but the idea of this is to look at the numbers of rules that the agencies are putting out each year. Just for example, we know Congress put out 211 laws last year. A lot of them were naming post offices and things like that. But at the same time, the federal regulatory agencies put out over 3,000. And that's a bipartisan phenomenon, whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president. We're getting over 3,000 rules and regulations. And since they accumulate, that's why there's some interest in rolling that back. So the Federal Register is this daily depository where they're published every day. Last year, it was over 95,000 pages. So that's a lot of rules and regulations. Some of those things may be doing a lot of good. Some may not. Some may be kind of in the middle, some may need reform, and that's the kinds of things that we can look at.
And the report in itself states that this year, the 2017 report, is unique. As the report says, it will serve as a benchmark to measure President Trump's effort to cut red tape against those of his predecessors. President Obama's final year in office showed a regulatory surge. Will Trump keep his promise to slam on the brakes of over-regulation? Talk a little bit about the pledge by the president and the executive order he signed about regulations.
Every president, you might have noticed, at the end of their term, there might be a little blip up in the numbers of regulations they have, and Obama was no different. It had happened with Bush, it had happened with Clinton. When Trump was campaigning, he said, when I come in, I'm going to put a freeze on regulations. And he did that. Other presidents had done that too. That's a normal step that they take. But he also said for every new regulation, agencies are going to have to eliminate 2. And not only that, of all of the new regulating they do, the net new costs are going to have to be 0. So there really has been a substantial freeze on the amount of regulations that are coming out through agencies. And it's very, very unique. When Reagan had first set up the initial review process for regulations that we have now, and it's been something supported on a bipartisan basis ever since through OMB, pages in the Federal Register, the numbers of rules dropped by over 1/3, and we've seen a similar thing here with Trump, and I haven't seen one quite so extensive, but I think a lot of it can be attributable to that executive order that calls for 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, however, also no new costs. Okay. So we'll see what happens. So that kind of makes this a benchmark for the next edition of 10,000 Commandments. Did he meet that pledge or not? Or did regulations continue? Things of that sort.
Okay, we're talking to Clyde Wayne Cruz of CEI about their new report on regulations. And Marshall is calling in from Youngsville, North Carolina on a Republican line. Hi, Marshall.
Hey.
Hi. Thank you for this program. I really enjoy it.
And what's your question for Wayne?
I am concerned about all the regulations, of course. Everybody doesn't like to be nitpicked, and some of them are nitpicking things. But to change regulations that protect us as society, just to be changing them, is pretty stupid. And I think Trump is an extremist. I think he is for the rich, and he is very concerned about making money for himself. He's always been that way. You don't go bankrupt and lose $90 million without cheating people, and I think he is dishonest. He lies every day. He gets on TV, changes stories, breaks stuff just before something else important's coming out, like the health care, and then he comes out with his Russian sympathy. But anyway, I want us to keep regulations that protect us, and yes, I would like to do away with some of the nitpicking stuff. I have some land that was developed, and the guy did all the things he's supposed to do for the inspector. Well, the inspector left, and a new one came in. Well, you have to put up another silt fence. He already had 2, so that's $3,000 more he had to spend. This is typical of what I call nitpicking stuff.
Okay, Marshall, let's give Wayne a chance to respond to things
Marshall's
like that.
right. I really appreciate the question. Marshall's the name of my youngest son, too. You raise a really interesting point. Remember I said this is a very contentious issue, and it is. No one likes the nitpicking regulations, but we all want to protect health and safety. That matters. I had worked at the FDA for a time, and I know exactly what you're talking about. You always just have to ask the question, is it the government regulation from the top down that's the best way to do it, or is there something else impeding health and safety measures? But remember, we can split the pie up. We can look at government paperwork. We can look at government health and safety regulations. We can look at the environmental type, which I suspect is what you've contended with. You can look at the economic regulations, and we can come together and say, well, some of this stuff is really, really tough. And if it's really tough to deal with, maybe Congress should step in and legislate on that regulatory category rather than the agencies bat this around so much. So we have to pick the low-hanging fruit, work on the existing regulatory body that's out there, come together with a bipartisan reduction commission, which is one of the bipartisan proposals that's out there to deal with the kinds of things that you're talking about. But thank you for the question.
Bruce is calling from Braddock, Pennsylvania. On our Democratic line, Bruce, you're on with Clyde Wayne Cruz. Clyde Wayne Cruz. Sorry.
Hey, Bruce.
Good morning, Mr. Cruz.
Hey.
I wanted to tell you a short story. When I grew up in the early 60s, we used to camp out in Lake Ontario every summer. And the first year I remember going there was just nothing but clean beaches and everything was fine. The second year, I remember going back, we couldn't wait to get to the beach, and when we finally did, there was dead fish all along the shore with tractors scooping them up and piling them in and burying them. We come to find out it was a plant upstream that was running whatever it was into the lake that killed off all these fish. And thank God that Richard Nixon had the foresight to go ahead and sign those EPAs, clean water, clean air. Because if we didn't have that, God help us, where would we be now? Thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate that question. That's right. This is what I mean. This is a very contentious issue. And remember, regulations are bipartisan. Republicans enact regulations and Democrats enact regulations. Nixon was the president when the Clean Air Act was implemented and when the EPA was formed. In free markets, remember though, you don't get to just willy-nilly pollute the environment. In free markets, there's a mix of liability, lawsuits, all kinds of standards that come into play to make sure that you can't pollute. What you want to avoid is over-regulating, but make sure that we address the right kinds of things. Yeah.
And so in the report, it estimates the cost of regulatory compliance to be $1.9 trillion annually. How do you come up with that calculation?
Yeah, there's a series of estimates that the government's done over the years. And at the turn of the century, the federal government, GAO reports and OMB reports were pegging it at around $1.2 trillion. It's essentially an amalgam of government studies, looking at the best ones that they have available in terms of the paperwork costs that are out there, the cost of tax compliance, the cost of other kinds of interventions. But in reality, there are reports out there from other institutions that say the impacts of regulations could be up to $4 trillion. There's a National Association of Manufacturers study puts it at $2.2 trillion. So I think looking at the federal government data that's out there and some of the other private material that's out there, this is a reasonable benchmark that we can say, okay, could be more than this, but this is a reasonable and defensible number. But a lot of these points are very interesting because we just heard about the nitpicky regulations, and then we just heard about the regulations that we need. A really good example that kind of captures both of that, just as an entity, the National Automobile Dealers Association, for example, had done a survey looking at all of the regulations that affected them on the shop floor, which would be out on the sales floor, which would be FTC regulations, Dodd-Frank regulations in the finance office, EPA regulations out in the shop floor and things of that sort. And there's not been a whole lot of that. But when the companies go through, they find there are a lot of areas where there's impacts. And it's that kind of thing, such as this year when Trump had solicited comments through the Commerce Department on what regulations are affecting us the most, which ones are impacting jobs the most. A lot of the comments came out about this kind of nitpicky regulation. There's something called the Regulatory Accountability Act now that's the primary bipartisan vehicle that might be a way of doing something about the issue.
Okay, and according to Politico, getting back to President Trump and his vow to cut regulations, it says that regulations have slowed to a crawl. The president promised a less active government, and data shows something starker. It's almost ceased issuing significant rules entirely. The piece goes on to say just 15 regulations were approved by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs from Inauguration Day until the end of May. Do we know how many, according to his pledge to get rid of 2 for every one that's implemented, do we know the rate, the number of regulations that have been cut amid this slow pace of new regulations?
Not yet. There are a couple, but not yet. Because the OMB is doing an overview of the entire regulatory review process. There are task forces being set up and all. It's kind of related to the ongoing executive branch reorganization program that's going on in the administration too. But things have stopped. Somebody was joking and said, well, how many regulations do they have to issue to get rid of everything? I said, that's not going to work. But things really have slowed down, and what it's causing is for each of the agencies to take a much harder look at what they do. The necessary stuff is still going to have to go through, and as I always insist, the regulatory enterprise is really Congress's responsibility. And so where we have rules that are hung up, like I've heard of rules and legitimately people have complained, this has been held up for 5 years, for 6 years. Well, in that case, Congress needs to go ahead and step in and take action and implement the rule if it's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay, we are talking to Clyde Wayne Cruz about regulations in the Trump administration and beyond. We are Republicans can call 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. And on our Republican line from Los Angeles is Freddie. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Anyway, I read in the comments that one time made a comment that the reason why World War II got us out of the Great Depression, a statement I don't fully agree with, but somewhat true, was that Franklin Delano Roosevelt stopped waging war against American businessmen to wage wars against the Germans and the Japanese. My point is, I think the comment is true to a certain extent. This country has a bigotry and a hatred towards businessmen. They don't think businessmen have constitutional rights or any kind of right of dignity or praise. We have a very anti-businessman attitude, and that's where a lot of these regulations get started. Well, it's against a businessman. We have a right to regulate how businessmen run their business. They do not. They have the same constitutional rights as everyone else. So it's something more moralistic than just purely economic terms.
Yeah.
Just because a person runs a business, he has a right to run it the way he sees fit, just like anyone else has a right to run their life the way they see fit. Anyway, I'd like to thank C-SPAN for the time.
Okay. Thank you for that. Like I said, it's complicated. It's very interesting. A lot of times it's the large businesses who seek out regulation in the first place because it enables them to cut back, to cut out their competitors. If prices go up, they can handle it. They've got lawyers. They can deal with it. Other companies go out of business, so they're left in much better shape. Other times we're back to these nitpicky regulations that affect small businesses. I saw one businessman who had written into the Financial Times. He said, when I absolutely, positively must hire a new employee, I go to bed, sleep well, and hope the feeling passes by morning. And that's kind of gets at the attitude that he's talking about here. Some people feel as if it's too difficult to start a business. The startup rates are down. You don't see young graduates going into construction or heavy industry or hospitality. Instead, they're creating new apps. They're moving into the areas where there's less regulation. If we think that's a problem on a bipartisan basis, we ought to talk about it and see what we can do about it. But I think there is a sentiment that it is difficult to start a business. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, both at the state and federal level and local. So there's a lot to that notion.
Okay, Scott's calling from Phoenix on our independent line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey.
Thank you, Clyde, for bringing up these issues and pointing these things out. The other media authorities that I've seen that have the broadcasting licenses are not talking about these things. I wanted to say that, just one second, that it's been 2 years now since I've been trying to find a way to read all of the laws as they are signed. But it's like trying to read, it's like trying to read movie credits at high speed. And then after my state in Arizona basically committed attempted murder on me, the Senate, nobody in office has written back. I've just been trying to get a lawyer for this for 2 years now. They've ruined my record, my future, my hopes of pursuing happiness, and it's just really bad. But I thank you for taking my call.
Okay. Thanks for calling. I wouldn't go try to read all of the laws, and it gets worse even if you try to read the regulations. Senator Mike Lee keeps a stack of the laws Congress passes in his office, and it's about this big for the year. But then the Federal Register that the agencies put out kind of goes up a little to the ceiling. There are a lot.
So what advice would you give for people who feel as if they are being affected by these regulations?
Yeah.
What should they do? Well,
the good thing now is the Trump administration is taking comments on this, and of course visiting Congress really does matter. The Commerce Department this year had been taking input on what were the most impactful regulations. A few years ago, Congressman Issa had done the same thing, had business writing in and contributing. But there are a number of hearings taking place looking at the regulatory enterprise. It's just that right now, the agenda here in D.C. with the healthcare debate, with the Gorsuch nomination that had occurred and the quick August recess, and now having the budget ceiling, the debt limit coming up again, there's a packed schedule in order to be able to do something about this issue. But I hope something brings it to the forefront, and I think a lot of the attention and interest by the business community and the public and job seekers and so forth is making a big difference.
Now, you mentioned state regulations. The federal government isn't the only body that does regulations, and some states are responding to what's happening here in Washington. For example, the repeal of the FCC rule that required internet service providers to get permission from consumers before selling information. According to Ars Technica, the California Broadband Internet Privacy Act was introduced in the Assembly, and it's very similar to the Obama administration privacy rule that was scheduled to take effect across the United States until President Trump and the Republican-controlled Congress eliminated it. How are you seeing states responding to what's going on here in Washington, the effort to roll back these regulations?
Yeah, this is interesting. The states can go either way. Some states, like California, whether it's an auto emission bill or sometimes internet regulation, surprisingly enough, given that Silicon Valley is right there, and you would think, wow, they would be opposed to such regulation. But some states are more friendly to it. They can handle it, but a lot of times you'll find that the states get fed up. And that's the last time we had major regulatory liberalization or regulatory reform legislation, whatever you may call it, was when the governors of the various states came to Washington and said these mandates are too onerous on environmental mandates and other kinds of mandates that are affecting us, and we need to roll them back, and that's the last time we got reform. The other thing is so much money comes from the states, from taxpayers to Washington, and then gets turned back around to the states in block grants and grants in aid and so forth. And those will often come with a lot of strings attached too, and that's several $100 billion right there. So when the federal government is also funding state initiatives, there's strings attached, and then that's going to mean new regulations and things like that. So it's very complicated. That's why I think, you know, the commission ideas, the bipartisan proposals that are being circulated now are a potential way out, but it's just that the agenda is so packed right now.
Okay, we're talking with Clyde Wayne Cruz, the Vice President of Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, also formerly of the Cato Institute, the Senate, and the FDA. And Barbara is now on our Democratic line, calling from Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts, there on Martha's Vineyard. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, good morning.
Hey,
Thank you to C-SPAN for this phenomenal guest. I mean, your producers are just beyond. Okay, I'm a PTA mom. I've got a suggestion. This is going to sound a little utopian, but let's bring the college kids into this game and create a national program across the country and all the colleges, universities, and community colleges, where the political science department and the economics departments get together and the kids review the regs, all right? So we could call it Students Review the Regs. And we could have this wonderful gentleman and his organization put up a whole bunch of YouTube videos, okay? Regs 1, Regs 2, Regs 3, 10-minute segments, all right? And give us the overview so that we can bring these students into understanding the federal government and the state government they're living in. Also, one more thing. When I was a parent of young kids, I took some fantastic parent education courses, and one of the things I learned there was that health and safety, obviously, you know, with young kids, is a domain that's separate by itself. And we need to just get the great big pieces of this regs monster. Okay, so you've got health and safety over there, then you've got environmental that's related to that. But break it down into the big pieces, and then maybe we could assign them to the colleges that way and see where we go. Okay, thanks.
And just on that,
on
that point, I want to point out in the report, the 10,000 Commandments, you list the biggest rulemaking entities, some of which Barbara listed there. It says the Treasury Department, the Interior, Transportation, Commerce, and the Environmental Protection Agency together issued about 1,428 rules, or 43% of all federal regulation under consideration. So
she has a terrific idea, though. Do you think we can get these kids interested? I have 5 of my own. I need to start with them, but she's a PTA mom, and it's a very fascinating idea because so much of the action now is on YouTube. I mean, I know this from my own kids. Enlisting kids in crowdsourcing, dealing with the regulatory enterprise fascinates me. So I thank you for
there you go. You have a new you have a new idea there. But talk a little bit about these regulations. Who who it is who are the folks who actually are doing it until we bring the kids in. Who are the folks who are making these decisions?
Oh, well, you know, 100 years ago, we set up the New Deal. After that, we had the Administrative Procedure Act that governs the way that the agencies issue their rules. There's FDA, USDA, FCC, EPA, on down the line. A lot of agencies, but as she was saying and as we were pointing out, they do it in different categories, and I really do think that is our way to wedge in and talk about this and not argue past each other or fight over things. And deal with those things. But every rule that comes through is supposed to have public notice and comment. The public gets to comment on the rule, it goes back, then the final rule is issued after that. One of the issues now is a lot of rules just aren't getting that first notice of proposed rulemaking. They're calling an exemption and they're issuing a final rule. Also, the other aspect of review for regulations is over at the Office of Management and Budget, the White House Office of Management and Budget. The major rules that go through, OMB takes a look at them to try to see if they make sense. But see, there's so many rules, it's extremely difficult to do. You know, I'd mentioned 3,000 rules going through each year. Well, of those, we always talk about cost-benefit analysis, but guess what? There's only cost and benefit analyses for a couple dozen of those 3,000 rules. Now, granted, they are the biggest ones. As I said before, Congress is naming post offices. Agencies are doing a lot of things that are miscellaneous, not that important too.
Right.
But the number of rules that have cost-benefit analysis is actually very, very small. So that's one of the things we have to reform. So that's how it works. The Congress passes the law, the agencies implement them. They're supposed to go out for public notice and comment. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Then what does go through should get reviewed, and it's so-so.
Okay. David is calling in from Texas on our Republican line. Hi, David.
Good morning.
Morning.
Oh, good Lord. I've worked in private industry of various things for over 40 years, and I sure would like to have a chance for about an hour to talk to this gentleman. First, I'd like to throw a white paper case out dealing with the environment and regulations that you just don't hear anybody talking about, and that's MBTE. That was part of the regulations back with the Clean Water Act in the 80s, which tracked through, I think it was finally dealt with in 2005. Well, it wasn't really dealt with. It was just all the states that were finally got to sue or were trying to sue the federal government to get hundreds of millions and tens of billions of dollars back. The Bush administration refused to let them sue. But the point was that the law, they put this additive in gasoline so that it would help improve the quality of the air. The problem was it was heavier than water, heavier than liquid, and it started leaking into the water systems from one coast to the other. Starting out in the Northeast, the reports got out, but for some reason, states in the West didn't pay attention to what was going on in the East. And when I was living in California at the time, I'm listening to all the horror stories in the East, and they started implementing it in California. Monica Crowley, I believe, and others, conservatives in the San Francisco area, started writing articles about it. They ended up having weekly protests in Sacramento. Thousands of people would show up. They were shutting water supplies down in all kinds of moderate-sized cities. Again, from one coast to the other, it's all out there to look at all this stuff.
All right, David, we only have a few seconds left, so I want to give Wayne a chance to respond to you.
Just a quick, I appreciate that, David. The main point is regulations can have unintended consequences. You may be regulating, you think you're regulating an aspect of safety, but you may be causing some transfer or some other cost. Similarly with, say, FDA, where I used to work, that we were undertaking a regulation to say, no, you can't make health claims. We got to restrict that. Well, what do companies do instead? They advertise taste, convenience, microwavability, portability, so you could actually have the average health quality, new foods go down. So you always have to think about those things. You want to do the right kind of regulation that makes sense, that is sustainable, and that is the right thing to do. Sometimes they can have unintended consequences.
All right, Clyde Wayne Cruz, Vice President of Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning.
It's been a delight. Thank you for having me.